If you have ever dedicated the best years of your life to a company only to be ruthlessly discarded when the economy crashed, you will intimately understand the tragedy of Gilda Gray. In the 1920s, her legendary Shimmy dance generated untold millions for Broadway's elite, buying her a fleeting world of gold-plated dinner parties and chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royces. But when the Great Depression obliterated Wall Street, the glittering facade of the entertainment industry shattered to reveal a deeply predatory machine. The powerful men who grew rich off her vitality used their networks to save themselves, completely abandoning their female stars without a single penny of pension, insurance, or protection. Worshipped as a millionaire in her 20s, she was later reduced to standing in bread lines in the depths of the Depression, a devastating victim of a system that treated a woman's prime as disposable. Gilda Gray was not born into wealth, nor was she born with a sleek, marketable name that would eventually light up theater marquees across the world. Gilda Gray was born Marianna Michalska in Krakow, though even basic details such as her birth year have been reported inconsistently across sources. Like millions of others at the turn of the 20th century, her parents looked at the grim horizon of Eastern Europe and made the desperate decision to flee. They packed what little they had and sought salvation across the Atlantic, carrying with them the heavily romanticized promise of the American dream. They settled in Cudahy, Wisconsin, a gritty working-class suburb of Milwaukee built entirely around the relentless, bloody rhythm of meat-packing plants and heavy industry. For the Michalska family, the streets were not paved with gold. They were covered in industrial soot and the freezing slush of Midwestern winters. The American dream promised to immigrants was, in reality, a brutal system of backbreaking labor, low wages, and relentless poverty. For young Marianna, the trap of her social class and gender snapped shut early. In the immigrant enclaves of the early 1900s, a girl was not expected to have ambitions beyond survival and reproduction. At around 15, Marianna entered an early marriage that appears to have been shaped more by family pressure and economic survival than by romance. Her husband, John Gorecki, came from the same working-class immigrant world that surrounded her, and the marriage offered little of the freedom she wanted. The marriage was not a romance, it was a transaction of survival, an attempt by her parents to secure her a stable roof. By the time she was 16, Marianna had given birth to a son, Martin. She was a teenage mother trapped in a grim, freezing tenement flat, facing a life sentence of domestic drudgery. The walls of Cudahy must have felt like a prison. She was looking down the barrel of a life defined by boiling laundry, stretching meager paychecks, and watching her youth evaporate in the steam of a kitchen sink. But Marianna possessed an innate, restless, kinetic energy and a fierce, burning ambition that could not be contained within the suffocating parameters of a working-class marriage. She refused to accept that her story was already written. To make ends meet, and perhaps to escape the crushing monotony of her home life, she began singing and dancing in local saloons. It was a rough, unforgiving environment. These taverns were filled with exhausted factory workers, men who spent their evenings drinking away their wages and their despair. To command the attention of a room full of tired, drunken men requires more than just a pretty face. It requires an iron will and an absolute command of the space. It was in these smoky, dimly lit rooms that Marianna learned the psychology of an audience. She learned how to hold their gaze, how to manipulate their energy, and how to make them forget for a few minutes the grinding poverty waiting for them outside the tavern doors. It was also in of these saloons that the legend of her great breakthrough began. Later publicity offered several versions of the story, and the most famous one framed the shimmy as an accidental discovery on stage. One night, while performing a particularly energetic routine, Mariana was wearing a chemise that began to slip off her shoulders. To keep it up without missing a beat, she began to shake her shoulders in a rapid vibrating motion. Whilst keeping the rest of her body relatively still, the physiological control required to isolate the torso in such a way was mesmerizing. The crowd went wild. When a patron shouted over the music asking what she was doing, her Polish accent heavily coloring her English, she supposedly replied, "I'm shaking my chemise." To the rowdy, drunken audience, it sounded like Shimmy. Whether this anecdote is absolute historical fact or a brilliant piece of retrospective theatrical myth-making is almost irrelevant to its cultural impact. What matters is that the dance was electric. It was a visceral bodily rejection of the stiff, corseted Victorian physical constraints that had defined the previous century. The shimmy was modern, it was provocative, and it perfectly captured the frantic, liberating energy of a generation desperate to shake off the trauma and rigidity of the past. It was the physical manifestation of a cultural earthquake, and Mariana Michalska was standing right at the epicenter. Recognizing that she had struck a vein of cultural gold, Mariana made a ruthless and necessary decision. The taverns of Wisconsin could not contain the phenomenon she had just birthed, and her marriage to John Gorecki was an anchor threatening to drag her to the bottom of the ocean. She made the agonizing choice to leave her husband and temporarily leave her child in the care of her parents. She bought a ticket to Chicago. For Mariana, staying in Cudahy meant a slow, quiet death of the soul. Leaving her child was a gamble of immense proportions for a young immigrant woman, but it was the only play she had. She was betting her entire existence on the rhythm of her own shoulders. In Chicago, the raw energy of her performance caught the eye of someone who understood the machinery of the entertainment business better than anyone else, Sophie Tucker. Tucker was a titan of vaudeville, a woman known as the last of the Red Hot Mamas, who possessed a sharp eye for talent and a blunt, practical wisdom about the industry. She watched Mariana perform the shimmy and saw not just a dance, but a highly marketable commodity. Tucker took the young Polish girl under her wing, becoming her mentor and her guide through the treacherous waters of show business. It was Tucker who immediately identified the first major obstacle, the name. Mariana Michalska was too ethnic, too difficult for mainstream vaudeville audiences to pronounce, and too firmly rooted in the immigrant slums they were trying to escape. She needed a name that sounded like money. She needed something sleek, modern, and memorable, a name that evoked the silver screen and champagne. She became Gilda Gray. With a new name, a revolutionary dance, and the backing of one of the most powerful women in the industry, Gilda moved to New York City. She was no longer a teenage mother from a Wisconsin meatpacking town. She was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the American entertainment industry. But as she boarded the train to Manhattan, staring out at the passing landscape, she could not possibly have known that she was stepping out of one trap only to walk willingly into another. She believed she was taking control of her destiny. She did not yet understand that in the boardrooms of Broadway, she was not viewed as an artist or even a human being. She was viewed entirely as an asset, a machine designed to print money for men who would never set foot on a stage. And like all machines in the industrial age, once her gears began to grind, she would be unceremonious, Owsley discarded. When Gilda Gray arrived in New York, the air was thick with the promise of the 1920s. It is easy to look at her transformation from Mariana Michalska, the impoverished teenage mother, into Gilda Gray, the rising star, as a triumph of willpower. And it was. She had defied the gravitational pull of her social class. She had taken a body that the world expected to be broken by factory work and childbirth and turned it into an instrument of power. But the tragedy of the self-made woman in a patriarchal economy is that she is often blind to the structural rot beneath the floorboards of her success. Gilda thought she had beaten the system. She thought her talent was a shield. She did not realize that the men who owned the theaters, the men who signed the checks, and the men who would soon make millions off her Shimmy were playing a completely different game. They were building wealth that would last generations. She was building a brand that was entirely dependent on the fleeting, fragile stamina of her own youth. The music was about to start, the champagne was about to flow, and the trap was set perfectly. When Gilda Gray stepped off the train at Grand Central Terminal, the air of New York City in the immediate aftermath of the First World War was electric, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes, cheap perfume, and raw, unbridled capitalism. It was the dawn of a decade that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of modern history. The trauma of the trenches had left a generation desperate to feel alive, eager to discard the suffocating moral conservatism of the Victorian era. New York was the epicenter of this cultural detonation. For a young woman who had just clawed her way out of a freezing Wisconsin meatpacking town, the sheer scale of Manhattan must have been both terrifying and intoxicating. She was no longer Mariana Michalska, the teenage mother bound to a sink. She was Gilda Gray, and she was carrying a physical revolution in her shoulders. To understand the explosion of Gilda Gray onto the Broadway scene, one must understand the precise mechanics and the social shockwave of the Shimmy. Prior to the 1920s, popular dance in white middle-class America was a rigid, upright affair. Movement was controlled, corseted, and designed to suppress any overt display of female sexuality or bodily autonomy. The Shimmy dismantled this entirely. It required the dancer to stand relatively still from the waist down while vibrating the shoulders and torso with a frantic, aggressive, and highly suggestive rhythm. It was a dance that could not be performed in a stiff corset. It demanded the soft, unrestricted flapper dresses that were just beginning to scandalize the older generation. When Gilda Gray brought the Shimmy to New York, she was not just performing a routine. She was providing the physical vocabulary for a generation of women who were demanding the right to move, to breathe, and to inhabit their own bodies without apology. But it is here, amidst the dazzling lights of Broadway, that we must confront the uncomfortable structural reality of the era's entertainment industry, a reality of cultural extraction that formed the very foundation of Gilda's wealth. Gilda Gray did not invent the physical mechanics of the Shimmy in a vacuum. Dances reliant on isolated pelvic and torso movements have deep, undeniable roots in African American and Afro-Caribbean communities. Variations of the Shimmy had been performed in black juke joints, tent shows, and segregated vaudeville circuits long before Gilda ever set foot on a stage in Chicago. The white American entertainment machine of the 1920s was ravenous for the raw, vital energy of black culture. But a deeply racist society refused to allow black performers to achieve mainstream, top-tier commercial success on white stages. The Shimmy's rise also needs to be placed within a wider pattern in which white performers often profited more visibly from movement traditions' root in black performance culture. This was not a malicious, calculated theft on Gilda's part. She was a working-class woman fighting for her own survival, but it was the ruthless, efficient mechanism of the capitalist machine she was serving. The studio bosses and theater owners funneled black cultural innovation through white performers to generate millions, paying little to no credit and certainly no royalties to the originators. Gilda was the beneficiary of this structural inequality, riding the wave of a cultural appropriation that the industry actively engineered. Her meteoric rise was cemented when she caught the eye of Florenz Ziegfeld, the undisputed king of Broadway. Ziegfeld was a theatrical mastermind who understood the corporatization of female beauty better than any man alive. His legendary Ziegfeld Follies were not just revues. They were industrial-scale productions that defined American glamour. Ziegfeld's famous motto was, "Glorifying the American girl," but the reality of his business model was far more clinical. He commodified the American girl. He selected women with absolute precision, dressed them in tens of thousands of dollars worth of silk, rhinestones, and ostrich feathers, and presented them to the wealthiest men in the country as living, breathing luxury items. When Gilda Gray was cast in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1922, she was not placed in the chorus line. She was the star attraction. Ziegfeld knew he had captured lightning in a bottle. He did not just sell her dance. He sold the entire persona of the Shimmy Queen. The marketing was relentless. Gilda was presented as a force of nature, a woman whose very presence demanded attention and wealth. The public responded with a frenzy. Theatergoers paid exorbitant ticket prices to watch her vibrate across the stage. The financial rewards that followed were staggering, almost incomprehensible for a woman who had spent her teenage years counting pennies for coal. At the height of her fame, Gilda G. Ray was widely reported to have earned an extraordinary fortune by the standards of the era. Adjusted for a century of inflation, she was generating the equivalent of over $60 million. She was a one-woman corporate enterprise. She transitioned from the stage to silent films, including Aloma of the South Seas, 1926, which helped sustain her national celebrity. She toured the country in custom-designed train carriages. The lifestyle she adopted was a masterclass in extreme, unapologetic luxury. She bought a spectacular estate. She draped herself in diamonds, famously purchasing a flawless necklace worth tens of thousands of dollars on a whim, treating precious gems with the casual indifference most people reserve for groceries. She was chauffeured in custom-made Rolls-Royces. To cement her status, she and her second husband, Gaillard T. Bogg, opened a wildly successful nightclub in New York called The Rendezvous. It was a masterpiece of exclusivity, a place where the elite of the city, bankers, politicians, and industrial tycoons, paid staggering cover charges just for the privilege of drinking illegal prohibition champagne and watching Gilda perform in the flesh. It is easy to look at this period of her life and see only power. Gilda Gray was dining with the men who ran the country. She was wealthy, independent, and universally adored. She believed, as nearly every highly successful young person believes, that she had fundamentally altered the rules of the game. She thought she was untouchable. But beneath the sequined gowns and the clinking champagne glasses, a deeply exploitative structural reality was hiding in plain sight. The entertainment industry was an oligarchy, run entirely by a tight-knit network of male executives, financiers, and producers. These men built infrastructure. They owned the physical theaters. They owned the film studios. They controlled the distribution networks, and they held the bank charters. They invested the capital generated by their productions into tangible appreciating assets, real estate, stock portfolios, and corporate mergers. The female performers, the very women whose sweat, beauty, and physical exhaustion actually drew the crowds and generated the revenue, were treated as highly paid expendable contractors. They were depreciating assets. The industry traded entirely on their youth, their physical allure, and their stamina. Showgirls and dancers of the era had few meaningful long-term protections, and certainly nothing like a reliable modern safety net. There was no concept of a pension plan, no health care provisions, and no safety net for the inevitable moment when a dancer's knees gave out or the brutal schedule broke her health. Furthermore, the patriarchal structure of the era dictated that women were rarely taught how to manage their own vast wealth. Gilda's husband, Gayard Boag, was also her manager. He controlled the contracts, he handled the investments, and he navigated the financial landscape. This blurring of romantic and financial lines was standard practice, and it was a trap. It created an illusion of security. Gilda thought the millions she earned were securing her future, but her wealth was tied to a booming, unregulated stock market. The financial acumen of her husband and her own physical ability to perform an exhausting, joint-destroying dance night after night. The physical toll of the shimmy cannot be overstated. The human body is not designed to sustain that level of violent kinetic stress without consequence. To perform the shimmy effectively, a dancer must lock her lower body and rapidly vibrate her torso and shoulders, creating immense friction and strain on the spine, the neck, and the cardiovascular system. Gilda was performing this routine multiple times a day, every day, under the blinding heat of stage lights while wearing heavy costumes. She was trading her long-term physical health for short-term financial gain, entirely unaware that the industry had absolutely no intention of taking care of her when her body inevitably demanded the bill. As the 1920s roared toward their devastating climax, Gilda Gray was standing at the absolute pinnacle of American society. She was looking out over a city she felt she had conquered. But the men she entertained at the Rendezvous Club, the bankers who cheered her on and bought her champagne, were simultaneously building an economic house of cards that was about to collapse. They had safety nets, hidden assets, and the social capital to survive a catastrophe. Gilda had only her youth and her savings account. The music was reaching a frantic, deafening crescendo, and the dancers on the floor had no idea that the floorboards were about to give way. The tragedy of the self-made millionaire in the 1920s entertainment industry is the profound illusion of inclusion. Gilda Gray sat at the tables of the super rich, wore their diamonds, and drank their wine, leading her to believe she was one of them. But true wealth in the capitalist machine is not defined by how much cash you can generate in a single year. It is defined by ownership. The men who applauded her owned the means of production. Gilda owned nothing but the rights to her own exhaustion. She had successfully escaped the freezing meatpacking town of her youth, only to lock herself inside a spectacular gold-plated cage. The executives at MGM and Ziegfeld's offices looked at her not as a peer, but as a particularly high-yielding crop. And as the decade drew to a close, and the dark clouds of the greatest economic disaster in modern history began to gather over Wall Street, the harvest was coming to an end. The industry had consumed her 20s. It had consumed her energy. Soon, it would demonstrate exactly what it does with the remnants. The autumn of 1929 in New York City was characterized by a manic, almost hysterical sense of invincibility. The stock market had become a secular religion, and the gospel it preached, dubbed as eternal exponential growth. Shoeshine boys were trading stock tips, bank clerks were taking out second mortgages to buy shares, and the elite of Broadway, including Gilda Gray and her husband Gaylord Bogue, were pouring their vast theatrical earnings into the Wall Street casino. To understand the sheer terrifying velocity of Gilda's impending ruin, you must understand the financial mechanism that trapped her. She was not simply putting her millions into a secure vault. Like millions of Americans, her wealth was heavily leveraged. It was tied up in speculative investments, bought on margin, a system where you purchase shares with borrowed money, relying on the stock's continuous rise to pay off the broker. It was a financial house of cards built on a foundation of pure optimism, and Gilda, the undisputed queen of the decade's optimism, was standing on the very top floor. Her life in late 1929 was a masterclass in insulation. At 34 years old, she was still commanding staggering fees. The Rendezvous Club was still packed with the titans of industry. She was insulated by her youth, insulated by her fame, and insulated by the men who told her the party would never end. But the men managing her money, the brokers, the bankers, and even her own husband, were blinded by their own greed. They failed to recognize that the American economy was fundamentally hollow, producing far more goods than the working class could afford to buy. Then came the final week of October. The collapse was not a slow decline. It was a violent, catastrophic severing of reality. When the market panicked on Black Thursday and subsequently plummeted into the abyss on Black Tuesday, the 29th of October, the psychological shockwave shattered New York. The ticker tape machines could not keep up with the volume of frantic selling. Fortunes that had taken a decade to build evaporated in a matter of hours. For Gilda Gray, the devastation was immediate and total. The shares she owned became worthless paper. The margin calls came in, demanding cash she no longer possessed, forcing the immediate liquidation of her remaining tangible assets. The banks holding her savings simply closed their doors and never reopened, swallowing her life's work without a trace of accountability. This is the precise moment where the structural abandonment of the era's entertainment industry shifted from an abstract concept into a visceral, crushing reality. When the crash happened, the stark division between the men who owned the capital and the women who generated the labor was brutally exposed. The studio bosses, the theater owners, and the Wall Street financiers certainly lost money, but they possessed a profound structural advantage. They had corporate shields, bankruptcy protections, and sprawling networks of political and financial influence. They could restructure their debt, fire their workforces, and consolidate their remaining real estate to survive the winter. They protected each other. Gilda Gray, however, was entirely exposed. The industry had explicitly categorized performers as independent contractors. She was a lone operator in a system that offered absolutely zero corporate protection. There was no bailout for the Shimmy Queen. The studio executives who had happily exploited her physical labor to build their empires simply locked their gates and turned their backs. The social structure that had worshipped her when she was a highly profitable 20-something now looked at a 34-year-old financially ruined dancer and saw nothing but a liability. She was spat out onto the pavement with terrifying speed. The immediate fallout was a public and humiliating dismantling of her life. The Rendezvous Club, once the beating heart of Manhattan's nightlife, emptied out overnight. The bankers and politicians who had paid exorbitant cover charges to watch her dance were now jumping out of office windows or scrambling to hide their remaining assets. The club was forced into bankruptcy. The fleet of custom-made Rolls-Royces was repossessed. The sprawling estate was lost. As the financial pressure mounted to a crushing degree, the facade of her personal life also collapsed. Her marriage to Gaillard Bog, built heavily on the scaffolding of their shared business interests, and the endless flow of cash, disintegrated into a bitter, acrimonious divorce. When the money vanished, the power dynamic shifted, revealing the harsh, transactional nature of their partnership. Gilda was suddenly left completely alone, stripped of her husband, her manager, and her fortune, facing the worst economic crisis in modern human history. To make matters worse, she could not simply dance her way out of the crisis. The entertainment landscape had violently shifted beneath her feet. The late 1920s saw the rapid advent of talkies, motion pictures with synchronized sound. The release of The Jazz Singer in 1927 had sounded the death knell for the silent film era. Almost overnight, the vast vaudeville circuits that had been the lifeblood of live performers began to close, their stages replaced by silver screens and massive speakers. For Gilda, this technological revolution was a professional death sentence. Her heavy Polish accent, which had once been marketed as a touch of exotic European mystery in the silent era, was now considered a fatal liability by Hollywood casting directors. They wanted sharp, fast-talking American girls for their new sound pictures. Furthermore, the cultural appetite of the public had radically changed. The starving, desperate masses standing in breadlines across America harbored a deep, bitter resentment towards the excesses of the 1920s. They did not want to watch the Shimmy. The dance was a relic of a decadent, arrogant past that had led the country into ruin. They wanted cheap, escapist Hollywood musicals or gritty social realism that reflected their own suffering. Gilda's highly specific, generation-defining skill set became entirely obsolete in the span of a few months. She was now in her mid-30s. In any other profession, she would be entering her prime. But in the ruthless calculus of the entertainment industry, a female dancer in her mid-30s is treated as a depreciated asset, a machine whose warranty has expired. The physical toll of dancing so aggressively for a decade was also catching up with her. The Shimmy had demanded immense, violent kinetic stress on her spine, joints, and heart. She had traded her long-term physiological health for a fortune that no longer existed. The descent into poverty was not a cinematic montage. It was a slow, degrading accumulation of daily humiliations. Gilda was forced to begin selling off the remnants of her former life just to buy groceries and pay rent. The flawless diamonds, once purchased on a whim, were pawned for a fraction of their value. The lavish furs were sold to second-hand dealers. She went from dining at the Waldorf Astoria to calculating the cost of a bowl of soup. She attempted to secure theatrical bookings, swallowing her pride to audition for smaller, provincial revues, but the offers were insulting or non-existent. The men sitting behind the casting desks, men who a few years prior would have begged for 5 minutes of her time, now dismissed her as a washed-up relic. The psychological horror of this transition is difficult to fully comprehend. To have been the most desired woman in America, to have generated millions of dollars through your own physical exhaustion, and to realize that society views your past contributions as entirely worthless the moment you stop generating a profit, is a trauma that shatters the soul. Gilda Gray was experiencing the most brutal lesson of the capitalist machine. You are only as valuable as the revenue you generated yesterday. The millions she had made for Ziegfeld, the millions she had made for the film studios, counted for absolutely nothing. They had kept the capital. She had kept the applause, and applause does not pay the heating bill in the winter of 1932. She was entirely adrift, a former millionaire standing in the long gray shadows of the Great Depression, waiting for an industry that had already forgotten her name. The Wall Street crash of 1929 did not just destroy Gilda Gray's bank account, it exposed the fundamental lie of the American dream she had been sold when she arrived from Poland. Her life exposed the fragility of a system that rewarded spectacle but failed to protect the people producing it. But the system was rigged. The architecture of the 1920s economy was designed to extract maximum profit from the labor of the working class in the bodies of performers while hoarding the actual capital at the top. When the structure collapsed, the architects survived by throwing the workers to the wolves. Gilda's descent from the penthouse to the pavement was not a personal failure. It was a structural inevitability. She was a woman who had fought her way out of a meatpacking town, only to be butchered by a financial system that treated her as just another piece of meat. As the bitter cold of the 1930s set in, the Shimmy Queen was about to face the ultimate test of her endurance. The glamour was dead, and the fight for bare survival had begun. The brutal reality of the 1930s was that the Great Depression was not a momentary shock. It was a long, grinding decade of relentless attrition. For those who had lived at the absolute zenith of the Roaring Twenties, the transition was not merely a loss of capital, it was a violent psychological severing from their own identity. Gilda Gray, the woman whose very name had been synonymous with the explosive wealth and boundless kinetic energy of the Jazz Age, found herself marooned in a desolate gray landscape of economic ruin. The streets of New York, which had once felt like a private playground, paved with gold and lined with adoring fans, transformed into a cold, unforgiving labyrinth of soup, kitchens, and relief lines. Try to imagine the profound, shattering cognitive dissonance of her daily existence during these years. Less than a decade earlier, she had been living in extraordinary luxury. By the depth of the Depression, accounts of Gilda Gray's financial hardship had become severe enough to symbolize just how far she had fallen. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the very factory workers and destitute immigrants she thought she had left behind forever in Wisconsin. To have your face plastered on every theater marquee in America, to have generated millions of dollars for the corporate titans of Broadway, and to eventually find yourself calculating the cost of a bowl of broth is a trauma that defies articulation. It is the ultimate betrayal of the capitalist promise. The system that profited from her in the 1920s offered her little meaningful protection once the economy collapsed. To make ends meet, Gilda was forced to swallow her pride and re-enter the entertainment industry. But the industry she returned to was a grotesque funhouse mirror version of the one she had dominated. The majestic velvet-draped vaudeville palaces were gone, bankrupted, or hastily converted into cheap cinemas. To survive, she had to accept bookings in small, dingy, smoke-filled nightclubs, venues so thoroughly disreputable that in 1925 she would not have allowed her chauffeur to park outside them. The humiliation of these performances was acute. The entertainment industry has always possessed a uniquely cruel mechanism for punishing women who have the audacity to age, but in the desperate, penny-pinching 1930s, this cruelty was magnified. She was no longer billed as the reigning queen of Broadway. She was billed as a nostalgic novelty, a tragic relic of a decadent era that the public now viewed with bitter resentment. The audiences sitting in those provincial clubs did not look at her with the breathless adoration of the Ziegfeld crowds. They looked at a middle-aged woman desperately trying to recreate the magic of her youth for a meager paycheck. She was forced to perform the Shimmy, a dance that requires an aggressive, joyful, and youthful physical explosion, while carrying the crushing psychological weight of absolute financial ruin. But the most devastating betrayal was not financial, it was physiological. The human body is a ruthless ledger, keeping a precise and inescapable record of every stress, every exhaustion, and every physical trauma endured over a lifetime. Gilda Gray had treated her body as an industrial machine, performing violent, high-friction movements multiple times a day for over a decade. The Shimmy, with its intense isolation of the torso and rapid cardiovascular demands, had systematically deteriorated her spine, her joints, and most dangerously, her heart. In 1939, Gilda suffered a serious heart attack that severely limited her ability to perform. This medical crisis starkly illuminated the terrifying structural inequality of the American workforce. When the male executives and studio bosses who had profited from her dancing fell ill, they retreated to private, exclusive sanatoriums, surrounded by teams of elite physicians, their wealth shielding them from the indignity of public wards. They had corporate health plans, vast savings, and the luxury of time to recover. Gilda had absolutely none of these protections. There was no theatrical union stepping in to cover her hospital bills. There was no pension fund established by Florian Ziegfeld to ensure his former stars did not die in poverty. She was forced to navigate the terrifying, precarious reality of the healthcare system for the poor. Her recovery was agonizingly slow and fraught with the constant gnawing anxiety of impending destitution. A heart attack for a manual laborer, and despite the glamour, a professional dancer is essentially a highly specialized manual laborer, is a death sentence for their career. The physicians delivered a blunt verdict. Shah-E could no longer endure the physical strain of performance. The very tool she had used to carve her way out of the slums of Cudahy, the body that had mesmerized the world, was now fundamentally broken. Faced with this grim reality and desperately needing a cheaper, cleaner environment to aid her failing heart, Gilda made the decision to leave the suffocating, smog-choked streets of the East Coast. She moved to Colorado. The high mountain air was a common prescription for respiratory and cardiac patients of the era, but for Gilda, the relocation also served as a profound silent exile. She settled into a small, modest home, a universe away from the glittering penthouses of Manhattan. The isolation of her new life must have been deafening. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life bathed in the roar of applause and the frantic energy of jazz bands, the quiet of the Colorado mountains was both a sanctuary and a tomb. She lived in deep obscurity, carefully managing her fragile health and stretching whatever small amounts of money she could scrape together. The public, always hungry for the next young starlet, quickly forgot the woman who had defined the movement of an entire generation. She became a ghost, haunting the edges of her own extraordinary history. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, and the world was consumed by the horrors of the Second World War, Gilda Gray sat in her quiet exile, reflecting on the spectacular rise and catastrophic fall of her life. She had survived the sweatshops. She had survived the treacherous men of Broadway. She had survived the Great Depression, and she had survived a heart attack. She had paid her dues to society 100 times over, and she asked for nothing more than to be left in peace. But the entertainment industry is a vampire that never truly sleeps. It constantly scours the past for intellectual property to exhume, sanitize, and resell to a new generation. By the mid-1940s, the Hollywood studio system was reaching the absolute peak of its power and profitability. The executives at Columbia Pictures, sitting in their plush, sun-drenched offices in California, were developing a major film noir project. They needed a character who embodied dangerous, sultry, unapologetic female sexuality. They needed a nightclub performer who could mesmerize men, a woman with an exotic, unforgettable name who performed a famously provocative, shimmying dance routine. From Gray's point of view, the film looked like a brazen appropriation of the name and persona she had spent decades building, and the studio showed little sign of caring whether she objected. In the spring of 1946, Columbia Pictures released a massive global blockbuster. The posters were plastered across every city in America, featuring the stunningly beautiful actress Rita Hayworth, wearing a strapless satin gown, her head thrown back in a pose of absolute intoxicating allure. And plastered across those posters in massive, bold typography was the title of the film, the name of the character, and the very identity that Mariana Michalska had bled to create. The film was called Gilda, for the woman sitting in Colorado whose chest still ached from the damage of 1,000 performances. Looking at the newspaper advertisements for the film was not a moment of nostalgic flattery. It was the ultimate unforgivable violation. To Gilda Gray, the film seemed to appropriate not only a familiar name, but also the very persona on which she had built her fame. They were stripping the last remaining asset she possessed, her identity, and commodifying it to generate millions of dollars for a new generation of studio executives, without offering her a single cent in compensation or even the dignity of a consultation. It was a theft so brazen, so structurally violent, that it snapped something deep within her. The quiet, sick woman in exile realized that the industry had not finished exploiting her, but the executives at Columbia Pictures had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that poverty had broken her spirit. They had forgotten that before she was a glamorous Broadway star, she was a fiercely resilient immigrant from a Wisconsin meatpacking town who knew exactly how to survive a brawl. Gilda Gray looked at the poster, and for the first time in years, the old fire returned. She was not going to quietly fade away while they stole her ghost. She was going to war. The premiere of the film Gilda in 1946 stands as a chilling monument to the cultural amnesia and corporate ruthlessness of the golden age of Hollywood. To the public, Rita Hayworth's sensational performance, particularly her famous glove-stripping, shimmying routine to put the blame on Mame, was a triumph of modern cinema. But to Gilda Gray, it was the final brutal confirmation of her complete financial and personal abandonment. The corporate machine had literally erased the living woman and replaced her with a celluloid fantasy, keeping the profit and discarding the human cost. It perfectly encapsulated the core tragedy of her life. The system loved what she produced, but it fundamentally did not care if she lived or died. As the box office receipts for Columbia Pictures skyrocketed into the millions, Gilda Gray sat in Colorado gathering her medical records, her old theatrical playbills, and the last reserves of her shattered strength. The industry had left her for dead, but they were about to find out that the Shimmy Queen had one last devastating performance left to give. The decision to sue one of the most powerful film studios in the world was, on the surface, an act of sheer desperate madness for a woman in her position. In 1946, Columbia Pictures was an unassailable corporate behemoth, flush with post-war cash and protected by an army of the most ruthless entertainment lawyers in America. Gilda Gray, by contrast, was a 51-year-old woman with a failing heart, living in relative obscurity, possessing a bank account that had been violently emptied by the Great Depression. The studio executives in Los Angeles must have looked at the legal filing with a mixture of amusement and irritation. They assumed she was a ghost attempting to rattle chains she no longer owned. They assumed they could bury her in legal paperwork, stall the proceedings until her funds ran out, or simply wait for her fragile heart to give out entirely. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman they had stolen from. Gilda filed a lawsuit demanding $1 million in damages, an astronomical sum for the era, citing invasion of privacy, the unauthorized use of her name, and the wholesale theft of her deeply personal, heavily cultivated public identity. The legal battle that ensued was a brutal, protracted war of attrition that dragged on for nearly a decade. To understand the emotional stakes of this lawsuit, you must look at the film itself. Gilda, starring Rita Hayworth, was not just a film that happened to share her name. It was a forensic reconstruction of the persona Mariana Michalska had bled to build. Hayworth's character was a nightclub singer, a woman of exotic and dangerous allure who performs a fiercely independent, highly suggestive shimmy-style dance routine to the song Put the Blame on Mame. For Gilda Gray, watching the film was like watching a grave robber parade through town wearing her finest clothes. The studio argued, with supreme corporate arrogance, that Gilda was merely a common name and that the similarities were entirely coincidental. They relied on the cultural amnesia of the American public, assuming that the generation buying cinema tickets in 1946 had completely forgotten the Shimmy Queen of 1926. But Gilda refused to be erased. She fought the studio with a bitter, relentless tenacity. She gathered her old playbills, her press clippings, and the remnants of her shattered archive to prove that she was the original architect of that exact cultural archetype. The stress of the lawsuit was immense, placing a terrible continuous strain on her already compromised cardiovascular system. She was not just fighting for a check. She was fighting for the basic human dignity of authorship. She was demanding that the capitalist machine acknowledge, just once, that it could not simply consume a woman's youth, discard her into the breadlines of the 1930s, and then harvest her ghost for a second round of profit without her permission. The legal battle stretched on for years, becoming an exhausting war of attrition. As the 1950s dawned, the landscape of America had changed again, moving into an era of post-war suburban conformity, leaving the wild, frantic memories of the Roaring Twenties even further behind. Finally, in 1954, faced with the prospect of a highly publicized trial that could potentially expose the predatory practices of the studio system, Columbia Pictures capitulated. They offered a private settlement. The exact financial terms of the settlement were sealed behind non-disclosure agreements, a standard corporate tactic designed to prevent other exploited performers from realizing they too could fight back. The settlement appears to have been far smaller than the $1 million she demanded, and nowhere near the value she believed had been taken from her. It was certainly not the $1 million she had demanded, nor was it remotely equivalent to the colossal profits the studio had reaped from the film. It was, in essence, hush money. It was enough to ensure that Gilda Gray would not die in absolute destitution, providing a small, belated cushion for her final years, but it was a pittance compared to the millions she had generated for the industry during her prime. With the settlement money, Gilda was able to leave her exile and move back to Los Angeles, settling into a small, unassuming home in Hollywood. It was a quiet, almost ghostly return to the city she had once conquered. She lived a fiercely private life, entirely removed from the flashing bulbs of the press and the relentless noise of the industry. She had secured her survival, but the victory was deeply melancholic. She was a woman who had lived 3 distinct lifetimes: the impoverished Polish immigrant, the global millionaire superstar, and the discarded victim of the Great Depression. Now, in her final act, she was simply a survivor of a ruthless economic structure that had tried to break her at every turn. In December 1959, the relentless physical toll of her past finally caught up with her. Gilda Gray suffered a second massive heart attack at her home. She was rushed to a hospital in Los Angeles, but the damage was irreversible. On the 22nd of December 1959, at the age of 64, the woman who had taught an entire generation how to shake off its constraints passed away. Her death was noted in the press, but the obituaries were brief, relegated to the middle pages of the newspapers. They wrote of her with a patronizing nostalgia, remembering her merely as a flapper icon and a relic of the jazz age. They mentioned the Shimmy, and they mentioned the millions she had once made. But what the obituaries fundamentally failed to mention was the structural violence that had defined the second half of her life. Most obituaries treated her with nostalgic brevity, rather than confronting the harsher economic realities of her later life. Gilda's trajectory from a $4 million asset to a destitute woman standing in a relief line is not an anomaly of the 1930s. It is a permanent feature of a capitalist system that prioritizes corporate profit over human welfare. It is a system that eagerly extracts the prime years of your life, promising that hard work will secure your future, only to completely abandon you the moment the market crashes or a cheaper, younger alternative becomes available. Gilda Gray's story has come to symbolize how easily highly visible workers can be discarded once their market value declines. Her life is a testament to the terrifying reality that exceptional talent and unparalleled work ethic are absolutely no defense against a structural system designed to exploit you. Furthermore, her story highlights the specific, unforgiving cruelty with which society treats aging women. The entertainment industry then as now is built on the commodification of female youth. Gilda was generating millions when she was 25, but by the time she was 35, the industry viewed her entirely as a liability. The tragedy of Gilda Gray is that she believed the applause meant she was valued as a human being. She had to learn, through the catastrophic trauma of the Great Depression, that she was only ever valued as a product. In conclusion, the legacy of Mariana Michalska, the girl from Krakow who became the Shimmy Queen of Broadway, is far more significant than a dance craze. It is a story of immense personal resilience set against a backdrop of devastating structural betrayal. She scaled the absolute heights of the American dream, only to have the ladder violently kicked away from beneath her. But even when the system stripped her of her wealth, her health, and attempted to steal her very name, she refused to go quietly into the night. Her final lawsuit against Columbia Pictures was an act of profound defiance, a demand for dignity from a machine that deals only in dollars. Gilda Gray died having forced at least one powerful studio to acknowledge, however inadequately, that her name and persona were not theirs to exploit without consequence. But the quiet sorrow of her final years remains a powerful, enduring warning. It reminds us that whenever an industry tells you that you are indispensable, you must look closely at who holds the contract, who owns the building, and who controls the pension. The music of the Roaring Twenties stopped a long time ago, but the ruthless rhythm of the economic machine that broke Gilda Gray continues to play on, waiting for the next generati ion of dancers to step onto the floor. Today, Gilda Gray lies buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, just a few miles away from the sprawling studio lots of Columbia Pictures and MGM. Her grave is modest, a stark, quiet contrast to the roaring, diamond-draped extravagance of her youth. Visitors who walk past her headstone likely have no idea of the colossal financial empire she once commanded, or the terrifying depths of the poverty she endured. They see a name and the dates marking a turbulent life. But beneath that stone lies a woman who embodied the absolute best and the absolute worst of the American century. She was the light of the Jazz Age and the shadow of the Great Depression. She is a reminder that glamour is an illusion, that corporate loyalty is a myth, and that true survival requires an iron will. The world took everything it could from Gilda Gray, but it could never take the fact that for one glorious, frantic decade, when she moved her shoulders, the entire world stopped to watch.